Okay, welcome back. Once again, my name is Dr. Roger K. Green. I'm making these kind of enhanced reading or contextualized reading lectures for an essential Shakespeare class that I'm teaching, but also I'm making at least the lecture portions available to the broader public. So within our course shells, my students have the access to the notes, and if somebody for some reason in the general public wants my notes, you can feel free to try and contact me via email if it's close to the time when I make these videos. So we've done A Midsummer Night's Dream so far this summer, and we're heading on to Hamlet next. So this is going to be an intro, just a general intro lecture to Hamlet, just kind of getting some of the historical and political context out and available, and also beginning to think about tragedy. So if A Midsummer Night's Dream was about comedy, was a comedy, and comedy had to do with doubling, with the ability for characters to substitute for one another. At least traditionally speaking, tragedy is about dealing with characters in their singularity, in what cannot be substituted. This doesn't mean that there isn't plenty of doubling that we'll see going on with Shakespeare and Hamlet for sure, but the genre tends to be distinguished from comedy, and at least in those two ways. There's a lot more to be said about the distinction. Just some general stuff around Hamlet. So Hamlet is dated around 1600. It's registered for publication in the summer of 1602. We know that this is the end of Elizabeth I's reign, and that James I is coming in. He will be in 1603. It's generally considered a mark of Shakespeare's maturity, this particular play, and particularly with its emphasis on the ability to represent the interiority of one's mind and one's thoughts on stage, which is a difficult thing to do because people are always having to sort of say what they're thinking and how do we externalize what is going on in our imaginings. And so yes, and I think that Stephen Greenblatt, I will follow a lot from just texts that I'll be referring to or quoting from Hamlet and Purgatory by Stephen Greenblatt, and Will in the World, also by Stephen Greenblatt, who's a great Shakespeare author. And then I will be using, there are lots of course, different versions of Hamlet. I'm using a recent version by Broadview Press of Hamlet, and it's been edited by David Bevington. So this is the one I'll be referring to. It has some nice contextual material if you have this copy of the book as well. Okay, so tragedy. Dealing with singular heroes, yet Shakespeare intentionally in this play names fathers and sons the same name. So we get kind of old Hamlet and young Hamlet, or young Fortinbras and old Fortinbras. And so this seems to be intentional. And Emma Smith, who I'm many of the points I'm making are sort of in contradistinction at times to the helpful Oxford lecture, which you can find online if you look into podcasts, Oxford's series on Shakespeare. And Emma Smith has a really nice lecture on Hamlet that I'll be referring to at different times. Totally free to watch, so you might accent this conversation with that. Smith points out that as opposed to the Henry plays, for example, where there are marked distinctions between father and son's names, like Hal and Harry, these types of other names before becoming fully Henry. that happens. And so it does seem to be an intentional choice by Shakespeare to keep the same name between son and father in those two instances. And so we have Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, and his father who's been murdered in the play. And we have young Fortinbras, who is kind of a mirror image of Hamlet, whose father has also died, and is going out and trying to conquer lands that his father had lost, or reconquer lands. And so we get a kind of, traditionally speaking, the Fortinbras character is the character of action, is out there doing the things in the world, whereas Hamlet is sort of stuck in moments of indecision and the inability to act. When we think about tragedy, I think we definitely need to talk just a little bit about some of Aristotle's classic terms for tragedy. He does it in a short, was collected as a short book. It's really just his kind of lecture notes, the Poetics. And classically, Aristotle applied it to Sophocles' version of Oedipus the King. So there might be a little bit of reference to Oedipus throughout these lectures, and also because so much psychoanalytic criticism has dealt with Hamlet, the character, as going through or displaying versions of Oedipal conflict in the Freudian sense as well. So we might get to that into some later lectures, not so much today. So just in Aristotle's terms, so Aristotle says that poetry, or poiesis, right? Poiesis in Greek is just the verb to make. Poetry, according to Aristotle, breaks down into drama, epic, and lyric, and drama breaks down into tragedy and comedy. Remember that Plato, in his Republic, had said that the only art that should be allowed in society is art that glorifies or hymns to the Republic or hymns to the state. He doesn't want to have any emotional distraction, even though he loves Homer and the tragedians. He can't figure out, Socrates in Plato's work can't figure out where it should be, although he invites this kind of discussion about if anybody can prove me otherwise, for why art should exist in the ideal republic or the state we might think of in today's terms. He's open to hearing. And so we see this kind of dialogue, and that's been the frame for the way that I'm teaching Shakespeare this summer. Is I'm asking us the overarching question: what is Shakespeare's answer to the role that art should play in society as well? So just because that's the way I've framed the course, I want to think about Aristotle's defense. So against Plato, who saw a flaw in art's representational qualities. Remember, Plato thinks that you have the ideal table, the idea of the table in the realm of unchanging forms, the eternal forms, and then you have the physical instance of the table that a craftsman might make or that you might be sitting at, and that's second order removed from reality, and third order removed is the person who might paint or draw that table. And so art, because it's a representation, it doesn't even have the kind of use function that the real table has, and it's three moves away from the eternal forms of reality itself. That's Platonic thinking, right? So Aristotle says, against Plato, who saw a flaw in art's representational qualities, Aristotle sees mimesis or mimicry and representation as natural to human learning, and the chief purpose, he says, of all composition is actually to produce mimesis. Babies can't learn without mimicking. That's how we do a lot of our growing in life. Poetry therefore serves society because tragedy allows audiences to purge excessive emotions. Audience members live vicariously through the dramatic players, and then learn what they ought not to do in life. Aristotle says that tragedy is a representation of a serious, complete action, which has magnitude and embellished speech with rhythm and melody, accomplishing by means of pity and terror the catharsis of such emotions. And so that word, hang on to that word catharsis if you haven't heard of it before, because it's going to have this purging quality to it. The emphasis that Aristotle gives is on the unity of a complete action, that's what a tragedy should do, is it really is an orchestration of one thorough and complete action, which in Aristotle's times would be fate itself, right? So for example, in Oedipus is fated to kill his father and to marry his mother, and he tries to not have that happen, right? He knows that this is his fate. He tries to get out of it, but it seems like everything that he does to try and escape it actually is what fulfills the fate itself, right? There's no way of getting out of the fates in the Greek sense, right? Even the gods can't change the fates. So we have time. It's a complete action. And over time, critics developed three unities: time, action, and place as well. I want to say a few things, and I'm just referring to it. This is an older translation of Aristotle's Poetics by Kenneth MacLeish. And because I think MacLeish has this nice passage where he talks about how some of Aristotle's terms are going to change in the Renaissance from the way that the Greeks perceive them, and I think that's important here. Let me give you Aristotle's terms first, and then I'll talk about the Renaissance. So in a tragedy, we have mythos, which is the complete action of the plot: the beginning, the middle, the end. Plot, characters, diction, reasoning, spectacle, and song. Think of it like mouth or storytelling. You could say it's the story itself. We get the word mouth in English from this older Greek word. So there's mythos, the complete action of the plot. There's peripeteia, which is a kind of reversal that happens at some point in the play. A change of intended effect, a shift in fortune, especially of a lofty character. Then we have Hamarsha, which literally comes from, it's a term from archery, of falling short of the target, often translated as moral blindness to a universal order, but I'll come back to that moral question in just a second. So Hamarsha is somehow falling short. Sometimes it's translated as excessive pride too, or hubris, is that kind of blindness to one's Hamarsha. And then anagnoresis, so, or recognition, from ignorance to knowledge. Another term associated with this, a Greek term, is metanoia, for example. So tragedy, as Aristotle says, should be complex. It shouldn't be simple, although it is really about this complete action from beginning to end. Everything should be geared towards the one effect. Pelagia Goulamari, who writes a book called Literary Criticism from Plato, I think it's Plato to Present is the subtitle, comes out around 2014. It's a really nice introduction to literary studies or to literary theory, and Goulamari says that Aristotle's tragic theory asserts that the soul of tragedy is not the interiority of the character, but the externality of the action, and that the best tragedies move beyond the suffering, but towards peripeteia and anagnoresis. And I think so that's important because Hamlet as a character, if we are going to go with what the critics have traditionally said, which is the mark of maturity here is Shakespeare's ability to convey internality on the stage, something like a conscience on the stage. This already is shifting the classical notions of what tragedy is during Shakespeare's time. Now, Kenneth MacLeish, in his introduction here to Aristotle's Poetics, says of this Hamarsha, right, which is that falling short piece of Aristotle's terms, Hamarsha in the Renaissance. This is what he says. Christian scholars who rediscovered the Poetics in the Renaissance completely changed Aristotle's philosophy, throwing into it ideas which have affected dramatic criticism and the criticism of Greek drama in particular ever afterwards. In Olympian religious philosophy, Greek religious philosophy, right, the restoration of order is enough to satisfy the gods. Logic is observed, the disturbance is forgotten, and serenity returns. In the Judeo-Christian system, by contrast, which would be Shakespeare's system, right, God must be actively involved in the process of redemption. So that's something we should think about. You know, if this play is coming in a Euro-Christian context here, is God somehow involved in the processes of what happens in Hamlet? Just an open question to maybe have in the back of your mind as you're reading the play. And in order for this to happen, so God must be actively involved in the process of redemption, and in order for this to happen, human beings must first acknowledge their guilt. Very Christian, sort of like the acknowledgement of one's guilt or one's sin. In the Renaissance, therefore, Hamarsha was interpreted as a failure of a specific moral kind. Oedipus, Creon, Heracles were guilty, and the process of restitution, which led in turn to the play's moral and religious message, involved them in realizing their guilt and atoning for it, and their suffering becoming a kind of penance consequent upon confession. The confession of the internal thing, the secret, right? In this view, Hamarsha is moral blindness, and anagnoresis, recognition or discovery, which in Aristotle was simply a matter of someone becoming aware of a relationship that previously was unrealized. And I think it's really hard for us as modern readers at times not to read our own sort of Euro-Christian baggage back, especially onto Greek plays when I'm teaching this on students. Often when we read Oedipus, you know, there's this conflict. Well, he should have done this, or why didn't he do this? Sort of question, which kind of takes us away from the externality, which was the emphasis for the ancients, and the internality. Now, I've also said in the Midsummer Night's Dream lectures that what's important for Shakespeare is he is holding as a model mimesis for his own art. He's looking back to Ovid and to classical writers. And there it is not the emphasis on originality, for example, that proves whether or not one is a good poet. It's the ability to deal artfully with a particular theme, and the themes would be related to stories that people often already knew. So what happens isn't so much what we're watching on stage. We know what happens. What we want to see is how this particular poet deals with this particular story, right? So if I just jumped to Aristotle himself in the constituent elements of tragedy again, tragedy is the imitation of an action, right? Which is serious, complete, and substantial. It uses language enriched in different areas, each appropriate to its part of the action. It is drama, that is, it shows people performing actions. The word drama means action. And not narration. It's drama and not narration. By evoking pity and terror, it brings about the purgation or catharsis of those emotions. Now, I'm going to have a lot to say about purgatory and purgation in this intro lecture and throughout the play. And that, again, is a very Christian idea, Euro-Christian, and it's a late idea, which might be news to some of you watching this. To sum up, Aristotle says, tragedy depends for its effect on 6 constituent elements: plot, character, language, thought, the visual, and music. These are the ingredients of tragedy, used by practically all dramatists. There are no others, he says. And then we get mythos and peripeteia and anagnoresis and hubris as all elements that are important in tragedy as well. If I go back to Guillemari, so Shakespeare's in the early modern era. He's writing at this transition moment between the antique or the classical world. There's the rediscovery of the classical world called the Renaissance or the rebirth, and there are stylistic elements in the Renaissance that are trying to mimic classical writers. So we come into, and many of the ways that people see Hamlet as a play is that it is a play that prefigures modernity, or that Hamlet is like an early version of the modern man. For example, many writers and intellectuals have considered Hamlet or used Hamlet to consider our predicament in modernity. Emma Smith counters that in her great Oxford lecture, and I'll come back to that at various times. And I think that it's a timely thing for her to be saying, that we need to be thinking about the ways that we have historically received Hamlet. That critics have used Hamlet to articulate their own ideas, such as Sigmund Freud, for example. In Pelagia Guillemari's book, she says, the multi-perspectivism of modern tragedy is intensified into epistemological uncertainty and breakdown of self-perception or disrecognition, while the multiplicity of the self is intensified into roles, performances of the self in the absence of the unifying rational core self assumed by liberalism or play. Instead, the liberal modern conflict between society and individual, the self, is now in a moral vacuum and lacks deep interiority, so that it is no longer possible to distinguish between resistance and compromise. That's Guillemari talking there. So that shifts us up, maybe that overshoots where Hamlet is at. But we see that in modernity, there's an emphasis on self, there's an emphasis on interiority, and that what we see with a shifting notion of how tragedy works is that in classic tragedies, there's always kind of somebody who's highly born, a noble person, for example, who falls from a state of repute, for example, or a high estate to a low estate. And so a lot of times dealing with a prince, dealing with royalty or somebody who's of an upper class, well, you deal with nobility because they have some place to go. That shifts to in the modern era to using the common person as the subject around which tragedy might be happening, and you can think all the way into like plays in the 20th century, like Death of a Salesman, for example, which deal with like characters like Willie Lowman, right? He's not important, and he's unremarkable in every sort of respect. So you can kind of see that trajectory towards the 20th century. But Shakespeare definitely is still dealing with a prince, Prince Hamlet, and Hamlet is kind of in the halfway zone here. There is a shift away from the nobly born protagonists in modernity, and so that gives us a question of like, well, how is a writer going to represent a fall if there's no place to fall from, or if you're not dealing with someone who was already in a sort of like upper class or noble type of position. How does the audience achieve catharsis without mimesis as identification? You know, if it's just like, oh, this could happen to anybody on the street, anybody like me, how are we getting that kind of massive catharsis that I think that Aristotle is saying that this is what art is for, is that we go and we see the spectacle. The spectacle is the most important thing. The spectacle is of this unity of action. It's of the way that the world works. It's of fate. It cannot be changed. We might have sympathy for the characters, but we see how order is restored, and then we go about our business, right? So there's a restoration of order and a kind of enunciation of what order is. Whereas in comedy, if you go back to my A Midsummer Night's Dream lectures, we saw that comedy is about the perpetuation of society, right? Comedy is about kind of loosening up society's rules so that people can hook up with each other, they can relax, they can have sex, they can produce offspring, they can produce the new generation of the polis. Tragedy is different. Tragedy is about larger conceptions of order and the things that cannot change, that we cannot change, for example. Hamlet is nobly born, but he is rather incapable, famously incapable of heroic action, and he berates his own self, as we'll see, especially in second soliloquy, for this flaw. In the 1800s, Hegel definitely read some of this into the master-slave dialectic, and his philosophy of spirit, for example, does a whole analysis on Antigone, another Greek play that's been used quite often, that takes on kind of Euro-Christian terms there as well. So that's Hegel's conception, I think, shapes a lot of the ways that we think about things, although I'm not going to go into depth today anyway on reiterating Hegel's master-slave dialectic, or the notion that history moves forward through a dialectical process. That's something that we inherit that comes after Shakespeare. And so just as a general intro, as we're looking back to a play like Hamlet, even though it's been used so often to articulate modernity and concepts of modernity and internality, I do think that it's useful critically to like put some distance between how Shakespeare or Shakespeare's audiences might have come at the play and what it might have been doing in his time, as opposed to the ways that it might be being used in the recent David Tennant version of the play, the film version, which is great too. Yeah, so there's lots of adaptations to be thinking about as well. Gulamari says that against neoclassical dogma, the tragedy concerns itself with the fate of the socially prominent. The novel, as a genre, is committed in particular to the serious treatment of common people, as Eric Auerbach claims in his famous book Mimesis. And that's just to mention, I mean, there aren't novels being written so much in English in Shakespeare's time, and so because it's so important to us now, I just want to sort of, to have us like put on some imaginary critical cap or something, and say like, okay, Shakespeare's not writing in the time of novels, not books aren't even being circulated. Shakespeare doesn't even seem to have been that concerned with publishing his own work, right? Even though Hamlet gets registered in 1602. I believe that it's Greenblatt who says this. The play Hamlet records for the first time in English 600 words that are new, and this is common for the time period. For the early early modernity, late 1500s, early 1500s, there was a conception that the English language is kind of poor, empty of thought. Skelton, I think, is one of the poets who makes this kind of observation. And so there's a bunch of importation of Greek and Latin terms, especially terms related to art and the Renaissance. And so we get a bunch of new words showing up. Famously, so I'm going to shift away from tragedy here and just to some historical context. Probably the most important thing, I think, framing Hamlet is going to be the Protestant Reformation, which traditionally is said to begin around 1517, even though there are earlier writers such as Erasmus and his praise of folly, for example, that are already criticizing the church before Luther legendarily, at least, nails his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg in Germany. And we know that that is where Hamlet is going to school. So that's why it's important to know that where Hamlet and Horatio have been going to school is associated with Protestantism and the Protestant Reformation, which earlier in the century changed everything, especially for people living in England, because it's Henry VIII who picks up on Protestantism so that he may get divorced from Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, who had also previously been married to his older brother Arthur. And the reason why he wants to, of course, famously divorce Catherine is he's trying to get a male heir for the throne. In this period, William Tyndale produces an English translation of the Bible, and that's inspired by Martin Luther's Theological Radicalism. The printing press, which was new in the previous century, begins to be used, especially early on, to spread Luther's messages throughout Germany, or what we would call Germany today. And that becomes important as well. It's like the shift to the vulgar language for theological texts such as the Bible, which then invites a lot more a wider speculation on interpretation and interpretive authority. Who gets to say what the Bible says becomes a matter of state and national concern. At least early on, Luther still believed in purgatory, but later on, as Protestant the Reformation sat in, the doctrine of purgatory gets dropped and it's being challenged more and more. So we want to think about purgatory a little bit, and again, I can't stress, Greenblatt's book Hamlet and Purgatory. It's not so much about Hamlet; it's really just about purgatory, but it's a really just beautifully done book. And so, as you may know, purgatory is this kind of place in the Catholic theology of the time, anyway, between heaven and hell. But it's not actually, even though it's pulled from Second Maccabees. That's where the doctrine sort of gets kind of wedded to the text, but it's not an ancient concept in Judaism or Christianity. It is a doctrine that arises in the late 12th century. So purgatory as a fixed place between heaven and hell does not occur until the late 12th century. The story of Owain Miles, who's a knight of the Round Table, is told in an 1180 treatise called St. Patrick's Purgatory by a monk named Henry of Sawtry, which was widely copied, translated, and circulated throughout monasteries. Purgatory is said to have been revealed by Christ to St. Patrick in a dream in this text. Thus, it is always associated with dreams. And there's so much in A Midsummer Night's Dream. We talked a lot about dreams already, and dreams will be another figure. So if we're thinking about, what is Shakespeare's defense of art, you might think about like, well, I'm going to try and answer that question, this summer by focusing my textual reading of Shakespeare on how does Shakespeare use dream? How does just the word dream or the concept of dream show up in Shakespeare? I think that would be a fruitful task of inquiry. Purgatory is said to have been revealed to Christ by Christ to St. Patrick in a dream, so it's always associated with dreams. And that's a medieval thing as well. That I think Greenblatt points this out, that the medieval mind really will give a lot of credence to dreams. But even in the Thomas Nash's book, Terrors of the Night, which I was using as an example in A Midsummer Night's Dream lectures, and which shows up, I think it's just as relevant for Hamlet. We see that there's a shift away from that. And Nash wants to distinguish normal dreams from the divinely inspired prognostications, for example, that might have come true in earlier time periods. Pontifical definitions of purgatory. So this is what's important, is that the doctrine of purgatory, the whole discussion, starts in the monasteries, and it's a monastic movement. And then we start getting more formalized doctrine. So pontifical definitions of purgatory appear in 1254, influenced by Sautry's narrative. Quote, "The monks who launched the story were not propounding the doctrine, they were," and this is Stephen Greenblatt's words, "they were shaping and colonizing the imagination, specifically the imagination of what, if anything, follows the death of the body." The doctrine of purgatory became a central point for the Protestant contestation during the Reformation. Greenblatt says purgatory forged a different kind of link between the living and the dead, or rather it enabled the dead to be not completely dead, not as utterly gone, finished, complete as those whose souls resided forever in hell or heaven. The whole social and economic importance of purgatory, again, this is Greenblatt, economic importance of purgatory in Catholic Europe rested on the belief that prayers, fasts, almsgiving, and masses constituted a valuable commodity, suffrages, as they were termed, that could in effect be purchased directly or indirectly on behalf of specific dead persons. Moreover, the Pope was the administrator, in effect, of an enormous account of superabundant satisfactions left by Christ, and further enhanced by the saints and martyrs, an account that could be expended in the form of indulgences on behalf of deserving souls. The reckoning in every case was strictly individual and scrupulously proportional to the gravity of the particular sins, but it was possible for individuals after death to receive help from others, just as living debtors languishing in prisons could have their debts paid by their friends. So there's a lot of work and scholarship right now being done on relationships between theology and money, between credit and debt. In sort of common speech, there's a kind of the assumption that spirituality and money should be sort of separated from each other, but scholars are telling us over and over again that we can't understand, especially Christianity and the New Testament, without understanding it in the economic context of Rome and Rome's hold over Jerusalem. So you might think about rendering unto Caesar and lines like that in the Gospels. Devin Singh's wonderful book, Divine Currency, is a good account of late antiquity and the ways after Constantine and Christianity becomes Romanized, especially, how that changes the way that we think economically. And there are ways to think that of our current economic situations as being very influenced by Euro-Christianity as a social movement. And I've said I'm working on my own book right now on Euro-Christianity and that kind of phenomenon. This idea of indulgences, this is probably the biggest part of the Protestant complaint against Catholicism at the time. The idea that you can buy and sell and hand out to those who warrant desert, I guess. I was going to say there, the ability to buy one's way out of things. The ultimate fate of the souls, just to be very clear here in Christianity, had already been decided. So whether you're doing Calvinist theology or Catholic, the idea is that yes, their Christian God knows what's going to happen to every soul is already known by the all-knowing God. So that fate had been decided, but purgatory comes in as this kind of middle area that's a stopover place for souls that are on the way to heaven. They're not on their way to hell. It's already decided that they're going to heaven, but they need to be purged of their sins before they can be purified to be able to enter into heaven. So that idea of purgation is so important theologically. It's a lot. I mean, we can think of it as this is all arising as Michel Foucault has traced in several books. The institution of prisons showing up at this particular moment in history as well. So the idea of time served. There's this concept of punishment, and that I can, once I've served my time or I've done due penance, then I can be released and move on in my life, whether it's in this life, material life, or whether it's in my spiritual life on the way to heaven. Greenblatt says, for example, he says Henry the Seventh, who had killed Richard III, constantly worried about the state of his own soul, because not only has he murdered somebody, right, which is a mortal sin, but he's disrupted the divine succession of kings and inserted his own self in. Besides establishing hospitals and almshouses, Henry VII saw to it that immediately after his death, 10,000 masses would be said for the remission of his sins and the good of his soul. That's a lot of masses. And there are some cases where, rich people would pay for masses to be said, for years after they had died, right? So they would prepay salaries of clergy people who would be saying these masses for them. This is all part of the economy of purgatory and purgation. And then indulgences kind of come in there as well. So Henry VIII broke this kind of thinking when he broke with the Catholic Church and followed the Protestant theology. Yes, maybe perhaps personally in some ways because he wants to get a divorce. But I think Greenblatt points this out as well. Like, I think having a father who was so obsessed with the state of his own soul, like Henry VII, Henry VIII there might be a little bit of like, just like, I don't want to deal with that going on. So there might be some pushback against his own father that is, a deeper psychological configuration than just like, oh, I want to get divorced from my current wife. So purgatory was also and always associated with poets. Poets were accused of having invented it. So again, that relationship to dreaming as well. The purpose of spectral visitations was most often to plead for prayers, almsgiving, pious fasts, and above all masses in order to obtain relief from excruciating pain. Now, this is interesting. Think about that when you get to Act 1 and you see what Hamlet's father, or the ghost, says to Hamlet, he says, "Remember me," but he does want Hamlet to get vengeance. So Hamlet is a revenge play, and there are lots of revenge plays at this particular time in history. The ghost, this is a long quote from Greenblatt, the ghost generally appears shortly after death. He's not talking about the specific ghost in Hamlet here. The ghost generally appears shortly after death, while the memory of the deceased, usually a close relative or friend of the living person to whom the vision manifests itself, is still fresh. Ghostly apparitions, then, are quite distinct from the persistence of the dead through fame. Hauntings are not about the dream of occupying a place in the memories of future generations, not about the longing to escape from the limitations of one's own narrow life world, not even about the craving for persistence that leads men to engrave their names on stone tablets. The spectral voice is not for strangers. It is for those who awake at midnight and think about the dead persons whom they have loved and wonder with mingled fear and hope about the fate of that person's soul. So, yes, it would be scandalous in Protestant theology of the time period to even have a ghost on stage, because if Protestant theology gets rid of purgatory, then the only way you could see a ghost, the ghost is only going to be a representation of the devil. The devil is coming in different forms, as Thomas Nash's Terrors of the Night book says. The devil comes constantly in the forms of people who look like our parents or look like our close relatives. Demons are all around us at this time, but there's no mistaking those in Protestant theology. There's no mistaking that ghost for the actual person who died. No, the person either goes to heaven or goes to hell, and death is the end of it. So there's no talking across over to that kind of middle state, at least in Protestant theology. And so we will see if there are famous passages in the play where Hamlet is wondering himself, like, he is on the one hand the play is very nostalgic, right? The ghost of the father says, "Remember me." And so Hamlet's always looking backwards, as Emma Smith says brilliantly in her lectures. So while critics have said that Hamlet points towards modernity of the future, if we look at the play itself, Hamlet is really kind of looking back at a better time with his father, who shows up as a ghost. He shows up in the armor of his younger years. He doesn't show up actually wearing what he was even wearing when he got killed. He shows up in the armor from his idealized kind of military youth, even though he's got the gray in his beard, as Hamlet asks Horatio about. So yeah, there's a kind of conservative element here, I think, that's going on with Hamlet. And if Hamlet is a tragedy, of course, that's partly what tragedies do, is they show the restoring of a particular kind of order, the things that cannot be changed, the things that must be the way that they are. So Shakespeare's already kind of like pushing buttons by having these ghosts appear on stage, and he was already doing it with fairies and these kind of pagan types of entities in A Midsummer Night's Dream as well. We know that at least by the time he writes this, the future king, James the First, or James the Sixth of Scotland, has written a demonology, which I'm looking at on my shelf over there, the demonology of James the First. And so he had a particular interest in theology and demons as well, and witchcraft. And so that might have lent a little bit more play, but of course Hamlet is being performed, at least while Elizabeth, or registered while Elizabeth is still queen. as well. She's at the end of her life, like for sure, but it's right in this transition period. So we need to look. I'm going to shift from Purgatory and Theology and the Protestant Reformation, which we could do an entire semester on, to just some of the political context. I've mentioned Henry VIII earlier in the century. He does not eventually get what he wants. He has multiple wives. Eventually does briefly leave the throne to Edward and then to Mary, also known as Bloody Mary. But from 1558 to 1603 we get the reign of Elizabeth I. Shakespeare's born in 1564. So she's the only monarch he knows from the time he's a kid. So Elizabeth takes over from Mary I, who had shifted back towards Catholicism after Henry VIII had broken with the church. But Elizabeth follows Henry in terms of her Protestantism, and really helps to establish the book of the Anglican Church, and then the Book of Common Prayer is of this period. These are really important texts of the period because they're establishing a kind of both a spiritual religiosity, but also civic religion and how we are going to practice that. And this is not a society that has any kind of inclinations between a separation of church and state, right? So she takes over from Mary, also known as Bloody Mary, who is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. So Catherine of Aragon has come up first, right? This is the first wife of Henry VIII. It was also she was the wife of his older brother, who died young, Arthur. So why is she important? Well, we need to think about this historically. She's the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain, right? So the alliance between England and Spain, especially what has just happened, the so-called discovery of the New World. So Spain is starting to make tons and tons of money from the spoils that it's taking from genocide and enslavement and colonization in the Americas. And so the alliance would have been a really powerful one. Mary, who's the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was married to Philip II of Spain. So it even doubly solidified that union, right? And when Elizabeth takes over, from the time she takes over, partly because she embraces Protestantism, she's not Catholic, there are tensions with Spain that erupt and that increase throughout her reign. Elizabeth was a Protestant following her father, Henry VIII. Mary's reign had briefly shifted the ties back towards the continent and towards Catholic Rome, and this led to several plots against Elizabeth, assassination plots. Okay, so now we need to think about Elizabeth's cousin, Mary Stuart here, Mary, Queen of Scots, different than Bloody Mary, right? She is born in 1542, so just about 9 years younger than Elizabeth, who's born in 1533. Mary, Queen of Scots, was 6 days old when she became Queen of Scotland. She's raised in France, while regents ran her affairs in Scotland. She's Elizabeth's first cousin. Her mother was Henry VIII's sister. She was regarded by supporters of the Northern Uprising and many Catholics throughout England as the rightful heir to the throne. So the Catholics in England are, of course, not happy with the Protestant succession here. Mary, Queen of Scots, is widowed at 18 years old from Dauphin of France, which in 1660. So she returns to Scotland And about 4 years later, she marries Lord Darnley, or Henry Stuart, her half-cousin. I guess it's about 1565. They have a son named James in 1566. This is James VI of Scotland and will become James I of England. Importantly, I think for this play is that in February of 1567, Lord Darnley was strangled in his garden, and his house was destroyed by a gunpowder explosion while Mary was attending a wedding. In his biography of William Shakespeare, Greenblatt's Will in the World, Greenblatt notes that by 1585, it was treason to be a Catholic priest, and by law, it was illegal, and after 1585, a capital offense, so you could lose your life, to harbor priests or knowingly to give a priest aid or comfort. In England, of course, right? The penalty for failure to attend Protestant services in the local parish was raised to an astronomical £20 per week, which virtually like no poor people could afford anything like that sort of thing. So Protestantism doesn't just come in as a theological, philosophical paradigm. It is a state and legal paradigm as well. So Hamlet is being written just as the succession of James, James is being anticipated, right, from Elizabeth to James. And there's a kind of question and anxiety about what he will do, what will happen to the law. Will he, unveil the fact that he has some sort of Catholic leanings? He is raised a Protestant, but his mother was put to death in 1587 by Elizabeth for plotting for yet another plot against Elizabeth as well. And all of those plots were backed by Catholics who did not want a Protestant monarch in England. So the question of anxiety around James being her son is important. So I think that's also it's important why James writes a demonology. Like, scholars will say he's not the greatest scholar, right, of demons and witchcraft and all of the period. But what I think we need to think about is the political context as well. So what does it do for James, the King of Scotland and eventually King of England? What does it do for him to be reputably known as somebody who is interested in theology, interested in demons, interested in witchcraft, and punishment as well? He seems to be rather obsessed with it. So there was considerable anxiety, as I've said, as to what James's theology was and whether he would shift attention back to Roman Catholicism out of revenge for his mother's execution for plotting against Elizabeth in 1587. James had written the Demonology in 1597, and this might have assuaged some fears. He also, importantly, turned out to remain a Protestant throughout his reign, and even authorizes the famous King James Bible, which comes out in 1611. It's important to think, because sometimes people say the King James Bible is Shakespeare's Bible. It's not Shakespeare's Bible, right? Because Shakespeare's basically retiring or moving towards retirement by around 1611. So probably Tyndale's version is going to be at least one of a few different versions. We also know Shakespeare's excellent in Latin as well. So Jerome in the Vulgate and things like that, he could read that as well. Religious strife, of course, in England did not end with the succession of James Stuart or James I. as the gunpowder plot in 1605 evidences, which then influences Macbeth. And I did some lectures on Macbeth last summer if people are interested in that. So here's a guiding question for us as I move to close this intro general lecture on just like the situation that's surrounding Hamlet. One is, I think, to what extent is James I's likely succession from Elizabeth on Shakespeare's mind as he writes Hamlet? Hard to know, but we know that historically, like in retrospect, we know that his company becomes the king's men, right? So we know Shakespeare already. We don't know that much about his life, but we know that he's a canny business person, right? That he is looking, even in A Midsummer Night's Dream, he was looking for patronage. Remember, there had been a plague that broke out in London in the mid-1590s, that this is partly where the sonnets start coming from, the longer poems that we're not reading in this particular version of the class, although for my students you are reading all of the sonnets this summer as well, and you'll have specific lecture videos on those. So I think that it's an important thing to think about, the succession. Shakespeare's already obsessed with succession. He's written several plays at this point in his career about the idea of succession, and we're reading one of them, Richard II, after Hamlet as well. So others, as I've mentioned, Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, Theodore Adorno, Aldous Huxley, Carl Schmitt, have frequently viewed Hamlet as signaling a shift towards modern life and modern anxieties produced through an internalized conscience. It's also common in Shakespeare criticism to see Hamlet as a display of Shakespeare's maturity, as I've said, especially in his ability to depict the internal workings of thought in a character on stage. Greenblatt's work supports this view, and I do too. I support that view. I think that Hamlet is a display of Shakespeare's maturity as a writer. But as Emma Smith at Oxford has noted, we are still in 2021 influenced, just like Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx and these 19th century critics were influenced by 19th century biographical criticism when it comes to authors, and reading the author's life as it sort of maps onto the artwork, especially in terms of a kind of linear development and artistic technique. And we might think, I've had like a side career kind of, or not career anyway so much, but I've played music in my life. And one thing that we know is that like bands might like their later work, it doesn't always just get better, right? Sometimes there are a couple albums, there's a sweet period, and that goes away and things transition and people go on and they keep making music, but it might not have that same remarkable quality. I think that's just a really easy example to think about there. Philosophers, when they look back historically to the early modern period, call this shift towards the internal the subjective turn. And we might think of those famous words by René Descartes. They're from 1641, which is a little bit after Shakespeare. But cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. When we look back, even though it's from an argument called Meditations on First Philosophy, it's really about trying to prove the existence of God through skeptical philosophy that says, well, I'm not going to take it on authority that God exists. So it's already countering the Protestant Reformation with the counter Reformation within the Catholic Church. So I don't want to take Descartes out of context here. He is making a theological argument, but when we look back, the focus is on the I. The I think. I know that I think because I'm a being who can think about himself thinking thoughts, right? So that's the shift from the externality of the the antique world towards internality. And we can do it with visual art, with vanishing points and all sorts of texts that shows the development of reading culture after the printing press and what that does to create a public of a reading culture. There are lots of ways to think about what's culturally going on in this particular moment. The success of Stephen Greenblatt's biography, Will in the World, which wins, it's at least a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, speaks to, I think, Emma Smith's point. Smith gives us an intriguing account of the play's nostalgic qualities and its backward-looking perspective against frequent readings of Hamlet as anticipating modernity. I'm going to draw on Smith at times throughout my own contextualized readings of Hamlet because I think that she's great and that she makes some really, really important points. Smith also mentions that in the past decade, we've seen an increase in attention to religious contexts around Shakespeare in general. And I'm going to go ahead and as I close this today, if you hadn't noticed already, I am of, I think, that ilk of people who are interested in increased attention to religious context around Shakespeare, and I would say in literature in general. So I'm going to go ahead and out myself here as part of a generation of scholars, but I will specifically name that interest one related to what I will call political theology. I won't use the term religion so much because the term religion is actually a term that has been used historically by Christians to distinguish their own theology from everybody else's theology that is actually considered wrong. They don't make up the word religion. It does exist in Cicero as religio, or to bind, or tradition. There are ways to think of it as that. But the way that we tend to use religion in the 21st century and common speech is really, really influenced by the Protestant Reformation, especially in the United States. So a lot of times people will think of religion in terms of belief, for example. Belief is a Protestant version. It has to do with what one avows and says that they have faith, or by faith alone, which is sola fide, which is one of Luther's famous phrases as well. So once we're getting into faith and belief, we're using a religion in a particular kind of way as something that you believe in or don't believe in. I will use the term, as I said in earlier lectures, Euro-Christian, all lowercase, all one word, to identify a social movement, not a religion. Both Catholics and Protestants are Euro-Christians. Even atheists today are still Euro-Christians, since the only way that they could come up with the fact that they're atheistic, that negation of the deity, is to have come from that lineage that where people were saying that a deity or something like it exists. And so their identity distinction is through a kind of negation to something else, right? So Euro-Christian produces the frame, the cultural frame that I want to look at as a mode of inquiry. And I will talk about it in terms of political theology, famously, and I will end here. I've got the book here. A book by a German legal theorist named Carl Schmitt in 1922 bears the name Political Theology. It can be associated within Christian theology going back to people like Augustine, and I'm not going to give you a whole lecture on this kind of stuff here. But Schmitt, who was not a nice person, to put it rather nicely, he becomes a very active anti-Semite, a Nazi, during the Third Reich, but continues to produce work, and he continues to be considered, especially even by younger Jewish thinkers, like Walter Benjamin being one of them, to be someone who's worthy of engaging with throughout his life. In his famous book Hamlet or Hecuba, which is written in the 1950s, Schmitt looks back at Hamlet and sees Hamlet as this shifting moment towards the naval empire that England is going to have as it takes over the rest of the world and maneuvers from this kind of the land locked notions of states to more of like globalized politics, also the kind of slow end of monarchies. And Schmidt is particularly nostalgic for monarchies. He's nostalgic for strong deciders. Writes a book called The Dictator as well. And interestingly, one of the 20th century's most important, I think, sort of art or literary critics in general, just sort of theorists, aesthetic theorists, Walter Benjamin, who is a Jew who dies escaping the Nazis, wrote a book, his dissertation or his habilitation in Europe on the origins of German mourning plays. And he deals with revenge plots and Hamlet in particular, but he cites Schmidt's book, Political Theology, as inspiration for his aesthetic ideas, although they have these really wildly different politics, right? So I'm sort of drawing this out partly because one of my charges in this class is I have to talk about Shakespeare criticism as well. It's a really massive area, but what is at stake in criticism for someone like, first of all, for me, when I look back at people like Walter Benjamin or Carl Schmitt, is that I'm looking at the ways that maybe critics in the 20th century looked back to the early modern period, to interpretations of the early modern period, to make sense of difficult political times that they are living in themselves. All sorts of writers do it. As I said, Aldous Huxley does it for sure. Freud, earlier, Marx in the 19th century. And so Hamlet becomes a play through which people articulate the social desires of their time, which is going to be my ongoing definition for literature and literary study, is that literature is the product of social desires that are produced over time, and literary inquiry is about the ways that we track social desire over time. There are other versions and definitions for literature that you might have, but that's just kind of the one that I'm going with in these particular lectures. I'm going to with that, I'm going to end here. You'll get more of that stuff. Lots of things to be thinking about as we head into Act 1 of Hamlet. Thanks for watching, listening, and for my students anyway, feel free to email with questions or concerns or things that you might need to have clarified. Have a really great rest of your day, wherever you are, whenever you are. Bye.